Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to be addressing this group this afternoon. As you will notice, unlike most of the presenters before you, I am not an engineer, I'm not a climatologist. I actually have a master's in public administration. That reminds me, when I was put to look into the issue of adaptation to climate change, I was thinking to myself, that's perfect. I don't have any tool. I don't have any bias. And this goes to the old saying that if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. Now, in this case, when you're dealing with adaptation to climate change, it helps not to have any specific tool because you need them all. Essentially, as we all know, the risk is changing. From an insurance perspective, obviously, it is important because we're insuring sewer backup that happen into basements. And the issue of water losses is one that has been plaguing, I would say, our industry, and it has changed very quickly in a very short period of time. Even 9 years ago, water losses were about 20% of the claims we were handling as an industry. In that short time span, it has now moved to about 50% of all the claims that we're handling. So it's obviously something has changed. And in terms of the amounts, we're pegging water losses at about $1.63 billion a year in claims, and it is significant. Now, all of that is not only sewer backup. Some of it actually is what we call mechanical failures, like the dishwasher that burst, and water heater, and all those nice mechanical devices that we have in homes, and we're having more and more of those. Now, of course, on the issue of sewer backflow, this is where both insurers and municipality need tools to better understand the risk. And one of the issues that we have as an industry is that, quite frankly, we do not fully understand the risks we're underwriting. And that causes some issues when you're dealing with underwriters and actuaries. Now, the genesis of what I call MRAT, a Municipal Risk Assessment Tool, actually is the IBC Vulnerability Assessment Protocol. And essentially, that IBC protocol is a very detailed bottom-up approach to try to look at the vulnerabilities of municipal infrastructure. And from an industry-wide perspective, bottom-up is obviously a good approach, but very much time-consuming. So we were certainly looking at something that would be faster to implement, and that's where the top-down approach is obviously the one that we are looking for. And one element also that is very important from an insurance industry perspective is that past losses are no longer a reliable risk indicator. You have water losses and sewer backflows in areas where you never had those historically. And 1 year, you can have a pretty bad claim situation, and it's going to be quiet for the next 10 years. So how do you fully understand the criterions and convergence of factors that led to a sewer backup incident? Now, the MRAT is a top-down tool, and it's of course based on a limited number of validated risk indicators. And as the definition goes, I think it's as good as it can get. It's a tool to qualify failure risk of municipal water infrastructure systems resulting in insurable losses both for current and future risk. It is based, as I said earlier, on the 20-variable risk formula, and it is a top-down approach. Now, who are the proponents? Who is dealing with this thing? Well, Insurance Bureau of Canada, through the Adaptation to Climate Change Committee, a board committee, is leading essentially this initiative. And the initiative is funded by IBC coalition money, but also the Natural Resources Canada has provided some financial assistance to continue the development of this tool. The expertise, as you will have guessed it, does not come from me. We went through an RFP process, and we selected Dillon Engineering as the engineering firm to provide that. And what won the day is Dillon had a multidisciplinary team of climatologists, engineers, risk managers, hydrologists, and they have further support from GIS and data treatment of Tessera, which is a Calgary-based GIS firm. Now, in terms of the development of the governance, we have the technical working group with whom I work very closely, which is made up of insurance industry senior executives, and I have a few members of that group here this afternoon. Mr. David Lapp from Engineers Canada, and David Lapp is essentially the mind and the lead behind the IBC vulnerability assessment tool. And the reason why we wanted him on board was to ensure that both methodologies were compatible. And of course, Professor Slobodan Simonovic of the University of Western Ontario, and as I will be moving forward in my presentation, you will recognize a lot of similarities in methodologies between the work that he has done in London and what we're envisioning for the Municipal Risk Assessment tool. In addition to that, we have what we call the Scientific Oversight Committee, and Professor Simonovic is there, of course, but so is Alain Bourque from Uranos, the climate modeling group in Quebec, in Montreal, actually, and Joan Klassen from Environment Canada, who is probably one of the greatest experts on IDF curves, and who has essentially converted me to the need of better IDF curves for the work that we're trying to achieve. And essentially, we will need, of course, a database and a web portal that will be able to support two types of users. And this is one of the interesting elements of this tool, is it is not just the insurance industry. It is designed as a collaboration between the municipal world and the insurance industry. Now, where are we? We have completed phase 1, which was essentially the proof of concept. We wanted to know, is it possible to actually have a top-down approach that would be fairly accurate? We worked closely with Hamilton, Winnipeg, and Fredericton. And of course, we needed claims data from both municipality and the insurance industry for calibration purposes. And what we found out at the end of this exercise is that the concept works. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Phase 2, which is where we're currently engaged, is we need to further test and calibrate the risk formula with 17 additional municipalities in 4 regions. And you will notice that the regions are actually climatic zones. The Atlantic, which is essentially the Atlantic region and eastern Quebec. Central, which is western Quebec and southern Ontario. The Prairies, which doesn't really need an explanation. And Pacific. We also need to build a database and a web portal. And we still have, and this is a very big component, determine the governance and ongoing funding for the tool. The phase 3, once we get to it, will essentially be the implementation. And of course, there are many issues which are not resolved, but that are being considered as we speak. One is obviously the whole issue of governance and funding. One thing that seems to be generating consensus is that the funding of the initiative should be paid for by the insurance industry. So at least the delivery structure, the database maintenance, and all those components, we believe, at least not so much we, but the CEOs who are actually paying the bill, are of the opinion that it should be the responsibility of the insurance industry. However, communications and public acceptance of the risk assessment tool is obviously a key element. And I like to say that even though from a technological and methodological perspective, the risk assessment tool is a challenge, that challenge actually pales in comparison with the challenges of implementing this on a broader scale. However, like anything else, it's possible, it's doable, and I'm sure that by working carefully and closely with partners, we will be able to achieve this. Now, what is risk? Essentially, the risk is the probability times the vulnerability times the exposure. I mean, this is as simple as it gets in those terms. What complicates this seemingly simple equation essentially is the fact that we have to combine climatic variables with operational variables on infrastructure, with the infrastructure itself. It has a number of variables, and we cannot forget the watershed in which this infrastructure operates. So you have hydrologic variables. Now this is a very, not as clear as I would have liked to, but anyway, this is a conceptual structure of the MRAT risk formula. At the basis of it, you have the location. which is essentially what we call the IBC Druid, Distinctive Risk Unit. And this is the spatial unit, and it's essentially a triangle that is the equivalent of 10 homes. This is the level of accuracy of the tool. And then you have to look in terms of vulnerability, exposure, and mitigation indexes. And once you've done that, you have to input the climate scenarios for future climate and current climate for the current risk. Look at the hazard, the probability index, then the outcomes, are you going to have an issue or not, and then the kinds of risks that you have to deal with. At the end of the whole process, you will have for each individual druid an overall risk rating. So that's very broadly defined what we are looking at. Now this is the druid, the basic spatial unit. And then we have to look in terms of vulnerability indicators. Now we have many more than that. This just gives you a sense or a flavor of what the vulnerability index could look like. We're looking at conditions that reflect the sensitivity to a climatic event. And hydraulic slope is one vulnerability. Land use, parcel counts, those are elements that do have an impact on the vulnerability. Combined sewer density. And we also have exposure index. Now those are the conditions that influence the severity of a climatic event. Land use, the type of terrain, proximity to water, all have exposure factors. This is an example of soil permeability for the city of Hamilton. And as you will notice in the downtown core, there's not a whole lot of grass because it's red. We were talking about, proximity to water as being a factor. This is an hydrological map of Hamilton once again. Now it's hard to find a spot that does not have proximity to water. Mitigation indicators, it is very important because it's one thing to know that you have exposure indexes, but you can also mitigate the impact of what are those exposure elements. And so those are conditions or factors which can reduce the impact of exposure and vulnerability to a climatic event. We're looking at operations and maintenance. I mean, this is an important factor. If maintenance has been done on a specific stretch of infrastructure, it does impact positively or reduce significantly, potentially, the risk. Emergency planning. A problem doesn't need to be a disaster. With proper emergency planning from the municipal infrastructure operator, you can significantly mitigate the risk. And those have to be factored into the risk formula. And so is the level of service. What is it designed for? Now, of course, with all of that, we cannot forget the climatic variables. And I know that today we've had a few discussions as to how is our climate changing. The key element, of course, is the real return periods. I mean, we have, in most municipalities in Canada, we have IDF curves which are based, or which were last calculated, and sometimes in the 1980s, if you're not fortunate, in the 1960s. For some reason, climate has changed. And I certainly don't intend to go into the debate as to the why, and in many ways, it's a moot point. The fact is that climate is changing. And we have to look at current updated IDF curves, and we also have, for the model anyway, we need to have future IDF curves which will be derived from downscale climatic information. And as Professor Simonovich was mentioning a few moments ago, any climate model will give you rain precipitation on a 1 hour increment. Now for an IDF curve, you need to have it every 5, 10, 15, and 30 minutes. So for that, you need to essentially use statistical methods and derive future IDF curves. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the overall risk index is based on 20 calibrated variables. Now, when we did the calculation on its accuracy in Hamilton, we had an accuracy of about 80% based on the municipal claims database. It's not bad for a prospective tool. What was more interesting is the same formula had a 94% accuracy based on detailed climate hydrology modeling that had been done by the city. So that tells us that we're on to something. It is not 100%, and I don't think it will ever reach 100%. It cannot by definition. It's a top-down approach. But if we can maintain a 90% level of accuracy in terms of prediction for an underwriting tool, it is actually quite useful. Now, we still need to calibrate the tool with longitudinal insurance claims data. And for that, we will very likely going to survey our members and get that data for 10 years just to make sure that we have very accurate information. And at the end of the process, we will have what we call a calibration algorithm, which will then be able to be applied to each individual druid. Now, I'm here on my little soapbox, and it's my infomercial for the need for regional IDF curves. As we, as specialists know, point IDFs have limits. And the limit of a point IDF is the fact that it's only good within, let's say, 10 kilometers from the point it's taken, for argument's sake. But the further away you go from a point IDF, the less accurate it is. And case in point, in the case of the city of Toronto, you would have very different IDF curves, whether you take it at the downtown airport or that you take it further north in the Steele and Finch area, for instance. So obviously, we need to find a way to have better regional IDF curves. And of course, too many weather observation stations with long-term weather data have been closed down. And that was as a result of some of the federal government savings in the 1980s when we balanced our budget. They had at that point done an update of the IDF curves, and they figured out that, well, they compared the old IDF curves and the new ones that they just calculated in the late 70s, early 80s, no real significant changes, climate is stable. So let's close down those stations, we don't need them anymore. Well, fast forward 2010, 2011, and of course we now know that our climate is changing and there is a need for updated IDF curves, which is very hard to achieve when you shut down the observation station in the 80s. You're not going to have 30 to 40 years of observation data that is useful for that. So you definitely need to move forward. Now, this is an updated IDF curve for the city of Hamilton. And in the dotted line is what was the old IDF, and the solid line is what is the recalculated up to 1984. And I don't need to tell you that since 1984 there has been quite a few severe weather events, and if we were to update it to that period, some elements of the curve are going to be slightly different. What it tells you is that the frequency or the return periods of events that are 50 and 100 years in return period is increasing significantly. At the same time, the lower threshold events, which are 2 and 5 years, are actually decreasing. And this is actually quite consistent with what climate modelers have been telling us, is that it's not that we're necessarily going to have more water falling down on southern Ontario. It's just that the pattern in which it's going to come down will be slightly different. And that, of course, has significant impacts in terms of the design standards of infrastructure. And this is what I call, the IDF is essentially the smoking gun that tells you that the climate is changing. It doesn't tell you why, and as I said, I don't think it is necessarily all that important. But a 1 in 100 could be a 1 in 20, 25, 23, 30, it doesn't really matter. The point is that the return period is shrinking significantly. So, and this is a point that I would like to make. Of course, in Canada, we've had this issue of deferred maintenance on a lot of our municipal infrastructure. This is nothing new. But what is the issue right now? It goes beyond that of deferred maintenance. It is one really that is one of design and performance criteria. And this is a significant issue that will need to be tackled by public decision makers. Because at the end of the day, it will require significant investments. Now, of course, in terms of tool capability, we certainly can look at the current risk. And from an insurance underwriting perspective, it is very important to know that. However, what it will provide both the insurance industry and the municipal world is the areas that are sensitive. It will not tell you how to resolve this risk. And there are many, many ways which risk can be mitigated and in many instances reduced significantly. And it is important for planning purposes. The other thing that the tool is designed to provide is a picture of what the future risk will look like. And essentially, the way we're doing it is probably the simplest way, is everything else being equal except the IDF curve. This is what the risk is going to look like. And we're looking at two time horizons, 2020 and 2050, and we're looking also at a higher threshold and a lower threshold in terms of the climate models that are going to be used. And this information is going to be available through a web portal. And essentially what we're envisioning is a GIS map per municipality, but also we are anticipating having a working session for each municipality, which will allow them to consider the impact of their mitigation measures on the risk profile for their municipality without it being actually being visible. So that might be an interesting portion, and that's what a lot of our members and stakeholders have told us. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the whole issue of adaptation to a changing climate and trying to understand our vulnerabilities and what is it that we're ensuring in terms of sewer backup. The problem is of course, climatic and technical, but what we have to create is a win-win. And I'm very fortunate this afternoon to be able to talk to actually both representative from the municipal world and representative from the insurance industry. At the end of the day, we're all in this together. And what we have to do is to create conditions that will eventually promote adaptation. Price signals and fairness in pricing is important. Homeowners, as we mentioned earlier in many of the other presentations, have a role to play. This tool is going to provide what is the municipal risk infrastructure, or what is the risk of the municipal infrastructure. It can be significantly different at the homeowner level. It's not because you are necessarily in a high risk that you cannot actually protect your asset, your most important asset, which is your home. And we have to look in the issues of incentive. And one of the other benefits that we can anticipate from having this tool is to avoid maladaptation. You know, having a sewer backflow valve, even though very useful, might not be required in every part of every city. Or it can be phased in onto a longer period, or if you're developing a new piece of land and you know it's an area that can be at risk, it might be a good idea to actually put that as part of the building permit. So, but the other element that is also very important is to provide infrastructure risk. And that's pretty much what I just said. But what I was also wanted to say is that the industry cannot develop individual risk without an objective understanding of infrastructure risk. As insurers, we insure individual homes, insure individual businesses, but they're all linked to an infrastructure element. And if we don't understand that risk, it is very hard to be fair in pricing and to be able to provide the type of coverage that is required at a price that is actually affordable by homeowners. And of course, and it has been mentioned earlier this morning, I mean, the insurer can work on premium, increase the premium, impose limits on coverage, or a combination of both. I mean, lower threshold of coverage for a lower premium. Or if you want more coverage, you pay a little bit more premium. This has been tried and is being tried as we speak by many individual insurers. Now, municipalities, of course, can have some benefits too. One of the elements is it could increase the availability of insurance. Right now, there's a lot of areas in many municipalities that have been, for better or for worse, by each individual company, red zone. So in some areas, very hard to get coverage. One of the reasons is that we don't understand the risk. If we understood the risk properly, and I have the utmost confidence in the ability of our industry to provide the kind of coverage for the kind of premium that is affordable. After all, as I mentioned many times, we are in the business of selling insurance, not selling insurance. And it is a very important element. It can obviously assist in the calculation of cost benefits for investments. by municipalities. It obviously is an additional decision-making tool that can be used by decision makers. And of course, as the process of developing the risk assessment tool, we need to update the rainfall and climatic information. So, and that is something that a lot of municipalities need. And of course, it will provide at least some information on the impact of future climate change, at least as it pertains to the sewer backups. And finally, which is really our hope, is at the end of the day, it will help prioritize infrastructure investments. Now, where are we? As I mentioned earlier, we're initiating phase 2, and we're looking for municipalities to participate in phase 2, and we are looking for a launch in early 2012. Now, this is some examples of maps, and you will see here, map is a simulation only. It is not reflective of actual risk. It is true, but it will give you a sense, or a flavor at least, of what is the potential of the risk assessment tool. And in this case here, the legend, or the category of probability, dark green is 0 to 20%, and red is between 80 and 100%. So if you're applying all the elements of the risk formula, and you're applying also the current IDF curve, this is what the risk would look for what we call the current risk. Now, as you're going into future climate scenarios, then this is the low threshold for the 2020 horizon. So it will depict what it looks like. And once again, the lower bound for 2050, which is a few years later, this is what the risk would look like. Now, once again, if you're looking at a high ring or the high threshold, this is what 2020 would look like and what 2050 would look like. So that's interesting in its own in terms of looking at what are the potential scenarios. The beauty about the tool is that we can actually go much more accurately than that, because when you zoom in, and this is a neighborhood, and actually this is what would be considered a higher risk neighborhood, and you will notice also that the level of accuracy, as I mentioned earlier, is those little triangles. Those are the individual druids. And even within the neighborhood, you can be green here and red there. That's the reality. And of course, everything else being equal, if you are looking into, once again, in the lower threshold, now this is actually the higher threshold, 2020, you don't change anything. The only thing you change is your IDF curve. This is what the look would look like. And 2050, once again, you don't change anything except the IDF curve. Now, what we are envisioning in terms of database is as follows. This tool cannot work without detailed infrastructure data that municipalities have. What we envision is, as municipalities do work on their infrastructure that can impact the risk formula, they would have the possibility to make real-time modification to their risk profiles. So you do maintenance, it affects the risk, the profile is immediately adjusted. And of course, the updated future climate model and IDF information provided by MRAT can and will be made available to the users. And we see two distinct types of interfaces, one that will be for municipal users and one that will be for industry users. And this is kind of the schematic that we're looking for, and there is an MRAT reporting client module for the industry and an MRAT uploader client module for the municipalities, with an analysis client module to allow in-depth analysis as we're moving forward. So this is, in a nutshell, what we're envisioning in terms of the municipal risk assessment tool. It is obviously, how can I say, new and groundbreaking, and obviously it is incumbent upon all the stakeholders involved in this fund. And once again, we're not in this, it's not us and them, it's us. As municipal leaders and as insurers, we're all involved in this fund. So if you have any questions, I will gladly entertain that. Thank you very much. Yes.
What the difference between the users, municipal user and IBC user? How they can? What the difference between them?
The main difference between the type of users is that the municipal users can, as I said, work on their data to determine, to make changes. The industry user will only have access to the current risk map because that's the only one that is of interest as an underwriter. Future risk maps would be available to the insurance, not to the insurance industry, but to the municipalities. We need to develop a couple of working groups to determine exactly what functionalities would municipal users would like to have on this tool. And that will be coming in the coming months. Yes?
I think that work is brilliant. I think it's worth mentioning that the City of Toronto has developed a tool as well. It's a higher level application. And what it does is you go into an entire city department, go on the department level, to understand the risk. So we've done a risk assessment now for our roads department, and we've looked at the current risk scenario and then into the future, exactly as we've done. Our process is more workshop-based, and it's really high-level kind of stuff, looking at, for instance, in the roads department, how would the signals of the traffic be affected? How would the pavement be affected? How would culverts be affected? How would bridges be affected? So we've done that. We've also done it for our social support and housing group, and our intention is to move that to other infrastructure groups, such as TTC. We're talking with Toronto Water. The other action I think is quite relevant for the whole GTA is that we're working with the Greater Toronto Civic Action Alliance to develop a working group on climate change adaptation, where we're going to be bringing together all infrastructure providers and key employers to help provide them with best available science and also concepts of tackling risk assessments within their respective organizations, ultimately moving towards the concept of understanding cascade failures and interdependencies of those critical infrastructures, moving overall towards an overall strategic approach for regional climate change adaptation.
Yes?
Yeah, mine's more of a comment as well. I mean, I've just convinced my municipality to volunteer to go in this partnership, because my question has always been, with all this climate change, why would the insurance industry even insure basements because of all the problems? And because a lot of the questions we get from people with homes is, I can't get insurance, you've done improvements, I still can't get insurance. So I see the benefit of participating in the program so we can get some people with insurance, and hopefully this will pay off to lower the risk or give them some sort of coverage.
Okay, thank you. Yes?
What level of granularity will the data be available in for the use of insurers to analyze and set rates?
The level of granularity, if your systems are available, will be at the Druid level. If you are not, because a Druid is about 10 homes.
10 homes.
And essentially, normally on a 6-digit postal code, well, it can be one individual building in a densely populated area, but if you're looking into a neighborhood or a suburb, like in my own case, in my own 6-digit postal code, there's 39 homes because it's single detached. It can be 45, 46 if you have different types of housings.
Can Druids be grouped into 6-digit postal codes? Or?
That is the intent until such time as the companies can actually have that level of accuracy. We would average out the risk per 6-digit postal code. Yes?
Hey, what's the level of confidence to these results? Because as usual, the climate change is, to calibrate a model, you need a large number of data. And we don't have them yet.
No, absolutely. The issue, as I said, in terms of the future risk, the future climate risk, we need to do a little bit more work. We're having now a limited number of climate models that are being used for the lower and the higher. And we will be doing a lot of research in order to make sure that we understand fully the level of confidence of future risk. But this is very much on our mind. Yes?
You mentioned getting information from municipalities about upgrades or changes they've made to their infrastructure. I'm curious where your base source comes from a municipality. Are you just simply looking at topological data? Are you looking at the piping network? What sort of things are you starting out with before you actually create this?
We started with everything, including the kitchen sink. And especially with the first 3 test municipalities, we really dug very, very deep into what was available in terms of data. And then the good engineers at Dillon looked at which one had the best predictivity. Yeah, I guess that's the word. If it's not, I just made it up. And from there, and this is another big challenge, is what importance do you give to each factors in terms of predictivity? And this work has been conducted, and what we certainly are envisioning right now is that yes, we are pretty confident in terms of the risk for a couple of municipalities, but we're trying to develop a formula that would be applicable to a climatic zone. So a lot more work needs to be done, and that's essentially the focus of phase 2, is to see how accurate our risk formula is in other climatic zones and in other types of infrastructure and hydrology and watersheds. And this is a big challenge, but one that, from a theoretical perspective, and Professor Simonovich is here, assures me that it can be done. All right, well, I thank you very much, and I'm sure there will be another interesting panel. Thank you.